introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm really delighted to see you all. If you don't understand me, raise your hand, I'll explain. And I want to also thank you. So the California Institute for Integral Studies, and especially the Department for Anthropology and Social Change, Andre especially for inviting me, and Sean for organizing everything. And of course, thank you in advance for your attention. So the title of my talk is, they say it's creativity, we say it's unwaged artwork, countering the invisibility of labor in the arts. And so perhaps some of you may be familiar, or it sounds a little bit familiar, this title, they say it's creativity, we say it's unwaged artwork, because it comes from, they say it's love, we call it unwaged labor. It's from the Wages Against Housework and the whole Marxist feminist slogan with which they try to demystify unpaid labor. So that's because I'll talk about this today. In connection, of course, to the question of, I like to call it artwork, and I write it, I spell it artwork separately, not together. And this, by this I mean artistic labor. So everything that, let's say, a person who we would consider artist does. And usually this work is not visible or not accounted for. We usually see the result, right? Like this, behind me, it's great. We don't consider the process which results in a painting like that as work. And so, when I sent Sean the summary of the talk, I said, right, is art a form of labor? And if it is a form of labor, what kind of labor it is? And I want to answer this question going a little bit in a roundabout way by telling you an anecdote that perhaps you will be familiar with. And it's from the contemporary art world, visual arts. And it is one of the countless examples that I could have chose to answer this question: if art is a form of labor, and if it is, what kind of labor it is. And it also really illustrates what I call the paradox of art, which lies in the fact that what artists do is not recognized as a form of labor, and is therefore also not appropriately remunerated. It doesn't have labor standards, it doesn't have any kind of social security, and so on and so forth. So it's a form of invisible labor, I claim, and I'll say more about it shortly, but first the anecdote. So in the fall of 2021, the media outlets were in full swing about the controversy that was connected to an artwork called Take the Money and Run. It was created by Jens Hanning, an artist from Denmark. Perhaps some of you may have seen this controversy. If not, if you Google it, you'll find a number of articles about it. So the artist created this artwork in protest of poor working conditions. And the artwork consisted of two empty frames that were previously part of his artworks called an average Danish annual income and an average Austrian annual income. And this artwork was in fact just that, actual amount of Danish crowns and of course euros that were framed in really, really large frames in the amount of the annual income. So when the artist was invited to exhibit these two works again, for this exhibition that was paradoxically dealing with the nature of work in contemporary capitalist societies, the museum, they initially discussed with the museum that the museum would cover the production costs for the recreation of these two works, right? Because he doesn't just store an annual income of Danish or Austrian at home to be framed whenever they need it. So the museum said that they would cover the costs, but then eventually they decided that they are not going to do that. That what they will cover is going to be the loaning of the actual, the currency, right, the bills. But that artist has to cover his production. So so, you know, getting to Berlin in his situation, framing and, you know, adjusting everything so that it could be exhibited. And because the museum demanded that the artist pays the production costs, Haning then sent the museum this new work, which was called Take the Money and Run, which consists of 2 blank canvases that used to be part of this work. The museum did get the money. He did not send it back. And as you can imagine, right, the media whirlwind ensued. The news outlets claimed that artists kept, pocketed, took, ran away with the money. And they all focused on the, you know, the majestic trick that the artist pulled on the Contemporary Art Museum, while also creating a brilliant promotion and PR. But of course, very few bothered to discuss the actual working condition of the artists, and that was not the point of the debate, not even among the participant artists. And so what I did was I asked, I sent out a collective email to all artists in this group exhibition, and I asked them if they plan any kind of solidarity action to support their colleague who is addressing these abysmal working conditions, or if they find that non-payment of artists' fees for exhibition is an actual issue. And guess how many responses did I receive?
1.
2. But neither demonstrated any desire or need for any kind of public support or solidarity or action. But so, like I said, this is yet another case that I could analyze in my book, Artwork, and because it continues to prove my point that the work artists do is not understood as labor, and that cultural attitudes about creativity and artwork are actually really don't exist, right? So there are no labor standards, the payment is very random, and despite all such protestations, this continues, this goes on and on and on. I'm sure that in a couple of years, maybe not, maybe let's be more optimistic, this will change. But, right, so a lot of this comes to then really exceptional, like I said, the PR promotion for museums. Sometimes even artists can benefit from the PR, their works would become more, they would have a higher price. In this particular case, that is not the case. Usually artists who do things like this, who actually publicly protest, are usually the black sheep, and the prices of their artworks usually go down because they're troublemakers, right? I mean, in this situation, the troublemaker, right, pocketed the money, robbed the poor museum. So considering this perennial precarity of lives and working conditions of art workers, I continue to ask the questions: why don't we consider art as a form of labor, and why do we continue to consider it as an act of creation rather than work? What do we gain, and what do we lose? And so in my book, my entire book is actually dedicated to this question. The reason why I wrote it and why I'm arguing for understanding art as labor comes on the heels of, let's say, a couple of, or at least a decade of, if not more, of research and practical and political work for better working conditions in the arts. I did, before I published this English book, published a book in Slovene language, which was called The Paradox of Unpaid Artistic Labor. And already there I started this, I proposed this concept of, the paradox of art, but also, I think more pointedly, in this English book, I'm trying to argue that art as a form of invisible labor challenges the contemporary discourse about what artists do. So I think that, and the central aim is to change this discourse and to challenge it, because it is not sustainable, I think, for anyone who wants to do art. If we don't consider art as labor, it is not really sustainable, and I'll come back to that. And so there are three, let's say, three main anchors to my argument. And one is my actual political advocacy organizing work in the art sector. The other one is Marxist feminist critique of domestic labor or housework. And the third one that I'll talk also a little bit more today is the historical experience of socialist or Yugoslav socialism. So consequently, this means that I understand art as a form of exploited labor. And by doing so, I challenge the art historical discourses of creativity and autonomy of art. And I offer in this book, and I'll say more about it today, a new reading and critique of autonomy of art as a bourgeois concept that contributes to the erasure of labor or work in the arts, but also erases the class dimensions of this problem. And in the book, I demonstrate how art in the West was historically founded or established on an erasure of labor and on postulation of autonomy that divorces idea of autonomy from economic aspects and produces invisibility of art as a form of labor. And because labor in the art is called and defined as creativity, which means it is essentialized and not understood as labor, I employ this feminist viewpoint and their critique of invisible work to show how such essentialization or essentialized definition of artistic work turns it into exploited labor. So this way I also demonstrate the relevance of feminist epistemology to counter the dominant views about artist labor. And I think that Marxist feminist critique is also important for my critique of autonomy of art, because I demonstrate that autonomy of art is not simply a gendered concept, but also a concept that hides the class politics by divorcing autonomy from economic aspects of art. Because, as you know, autonomy of art is usually posited as something which divorces art from economic aspects. So we are autonomous, we are free to do whatever, we don't care about the money, right? There's a great text by a Belgian philosopher. He says, you are an artist, you don't do it for the money. It's a great way for people not to pay you. So, anyway. So I'm gonna assume, are you familiar with the feminist critique of women's work as unrecognized labor? Okay, good. So like the quintessential form of invisible labor, right? So I'm not gonna go into great detail. So Marxist feminist theorists and activists such as Silvia Federici, who you also had the opportunity and honor to hear, Selma James, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa made this groundbreaking analysis during the 1970s, where they uncovered that the separation of the realm of social reproduction, where housework, domestic labor belongs, into this private sphere, made a large area of exploitation and unpaid labor invisible. And the invisibility of housework as a form of work, Marxist feminists demonstrated, is perpetuated by two operations. These two mechanisms, one mechanism is a mechanism of essentialization, which defines this work as the essence of a feminine physique, right? Or by construction of the fictional private sphere. And these two operations are also central in the context of the arts and have enduring implications for cultural attitudes towards artist labor and its invisibility as a form of work. So it results, and it is also, so I'm just gonna say, my argument is that artists experience a similar kind of invisibility of their labor. And that's why I'm comparing domestic labor with artistic labor. Because just like housework, which is historically and socially constructed as a natural attribute of female subjects, or the labor of love, the labor of the artist has historically been redefined as embodied creativity, or an inborn faculty of an artist, right? If you're an artist, you're supposed to possess a particular talent. And for instance, I'm not an artist, which means I don't have that talent, and somebody else who is an artist has that talent. And in both cases, particular skills get essentialized or declared or culturally constructed as naturally stemming from the subject's essence or nature. And neither is defined as work. They're invisible in relation to the process of their production. But while we owe it to the Marxist feminists who demystified the essentializing principle that turns housework into non-work and becomes the fulcrum of exploitation and oppression of women under capitalism, the discourse of aesthetics and art theory uncritically perpetuates ideas about artistic practice as non-work, or an exceptional kind of labor that reproduces this essentialization of artist's work as an attribute of creativity or creative genius. So while one form of invisibility invokes the other, and there are a lot of striking parallels between the two, what is also interesting is the differences that when we compare these two types of work. Because when people say that art is not recognized as labor, people would say, well, of course not. Whereas with women, they would say, oh yeah, true, right? I mean, domestic work is actual work and nobody likes to do it. But if we address the issue of unpaid domestic labor, women benefit, but with art it becomes complicated precisely because calling artists workers and considering them from a labor point of view appears to take away the only reward that artists often get, right? That is admiration, that they are exceptional, exceptionally creative, and so on and so forth. So in other words, essentialization in the case of artwork is perceived as positive, unlike domestic labor, and it makes art look natural, so not work. And it therefore legitimizes the invisibility of labor in a way that may be worse than with domestic labor. With artists, the positive valence associated with this, with an essentialism that does maintain the difference and exceptional nature of each artist, it makes it harder to rebel and want to reform it. It makes it easier to accept a non-remunerated approach to artwork. And so, understanding art as a form of invisibilized labor gives insight into these very mechanisms that drive the economic exploitation of artist labor to this day. And so I think that these two theoretical contributions in feminist epistemology are particularly resonant when it comes to theorizing the invisibilized labor of the artist, right? So this structural component of invisible work that rests on the separation of public or domestic or private sphere, or if you will, the sphere of production and reproduction, under capitalism, whereby the latter is excluded from the economy, but is nevertheless a site of both value creation as well as social and economic exploitation. So that's the first thing. And the second is this essentializing or essentialization of particular types of work or skills, which leads to their economic devaluation. And the first contribution helps us understand that treating art as non-labor under capitalism leads to its invisibility and consequently exploitation. And the second one helps us understand that, that the operating logic behind this invisibility. So finally, looking at artwork as a form of invisibilized labor helps us to conceive of artwork and its poorly remunerated condition as a political question. And as a site of struggle for labor standards for art workers. So in this struggle we can learn and use the feminist analysis as the necessary tactical tool for demystification. Or to paraphrase it with this Marxist slogan that I used as the title, they call it creativity, we call it unwaged artwork. Or we can be even more blunt, we call it exploitation. And so I say much more about this in my book, especially the first and the second chapters are dedicated to demystifying to what I just told you here very briefly. But I would like to spend some time today also on the legacy of Yugoslav socialism, because my whole argument, or as I call it, a stepping stone in my book, is actually indebted to the history of Yugoslav socialism and the transformation of artistic labor that took place during the existence of socialist Yugoslavia. So, right, socialist Yugoslavia existed from 1945 to 1991 for 45 years. And I will now focus on these experiences of art workers and the history of labor regulation in socialist Yugoslavia to help us understand a little bit how this informs my argument, right? Why do I talk about art as labor? Why do I talk about artists as workers? And what does all this have to do with socialism? And I think that in this way, I would like also to say that you are anthropologists, not historians, but history is very important. But for me, history is not, let's say, a dull or a boring pile of experiences, but it's something that we really need to understand because it can inform our contemporary struggle. So the things that went wrong in certain periods of struggle can really change the way we think about things. And I'll come back at the end. So the book has 6 chapters, and in the majority of them, I would say from 3 to 6, I narrate the story, the history of what happened in Yugoslavia in terms of artists and artworks. I'm just gonna tell you a couple of things, right? So the context of socialist Yugoslavia is so important because the paradoxical status of artistic labor or artwork that the history of this country engenders was really interesting because artistic labor in Yugoslavia was paid or remunerated. It included social rights, social protection, and labor rights. But this was also the case in some other socialist countries, so Yugoslavia was not exceptional in that sense. But because Yugoslavia was positioned between the Cold War blocs, that is, was neither Stalinist as USSR or capitalist as USA, there was some kind of ideological in-betweenness. This provided a really interesting context for a very idiosyncratic form of socialism, which was called self-managed socialism. And in this form of socialism, art thrived as paid and creative practice for artists, but also for general population. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, or not at all here, but in the book I explain how the stages of political economy and cultural policies that instituted art as work, and actually how this became undone. Because in the first 20 years of the Yugoslav existence, art was really treated as work, and all these labor rights and standards were implemented, but by the end of the 70s, this got somehow unmade, and I'll tell you a little bit more why. So the labor policies of Yugoslav self-management opposed the traditional institutionalization of art by protecting art as labor. Yet, at the same time, they also upheld artistic labor as an exceptional type of work that took place within a secluded autonomous sphere of art. And what emerged in Yugoslavia during the first half of its existence was what I call the socialist institution of art, where you had ideas of autonomy of art, but they coexisted with art as a form of labor. So you had both things. Art was paid, artists had social security and they were paid, but at the same time there was also the idea of autonomy. So this explains why Yugoslavia's development of production model for art and culture was unique, but also how it was connected to Western philosophical traditions that hold sway on the understanding of art and artistic labor. So while during the first half of Yugoslavia's existence there was hardly any exploitation of artistic labor because of these guaranteed minimum fees and social welfare provision for art workers, this changed rapidly during the second half of Yugoslavia's existence, and especially during the 80s. And so this is a very complicated process that I'm really now talking about in very schematic terms, but you know, like in the book there are 3 chapters about this because it's complicated, but I'm hopefully making some sense to you of what happened. So when I said that in the first half of Yugoslavia's existence we had autonomy and we had the idea of art as labor and payment and so on and so forth. But during the final decade of socialist Yugoslavia, this idea of self-management got actually redeployed as a facade for neoliberal policies. And so art workers were then turned into these self-sufficient, self-managed, and self-responsible socialist entrepreneurs. I mean, they were not called socialist entrepreneurs, but that's what they were. And this is why this transformation, which happened in the 80s, is so important. Because what is interesting in the Yugoslav case is that what deteriorated first was not necessarily the payment itself, but the idea that artists are workers, and therefore it was easy to take away all these worker and labor standards of, let's say, sick leave, maternity leave, and so on and so forth. And so while Yugoslav cultural policy during early stages of socialism protected art workers and their labor and social standards, the shift in economic policies during the 70s that emphasized market logic played on the ideas of art as a realm of freedom and creativity. And this actually, in turn, made it easier to separate artists as workers and artists as creative individuals, and it restructured the working conditions of artists. Because the conditions for artwork were no longer based on welfare, social security, and workers' rights, and they leaned toward models based on self-employment that turned art workers into these socialist entrepreneurs with much lower incomes and less access to these social security and labor rights. And so I discussed this process because I think the mystification of artistic labor under socialism, and especially after in the second part during the late 70s and 80s, reveals a contradiction that was present in the Yugoslav socialism as well. Because it paradoxically reproduced and corroborated and eventually recuperated Western bourgeois aesthetic and philosophical traditions, and the ideas about autonomy, creativity in particular. And so we have some really interesting artists in Yugoslavia, and I talk about them in the book in more detail, which really saw this thing taking place, right? So we have a very interesting artist, his name is Goran Đorđević, who was noticing this, that artists were no longer understood as workers, but as some special creative individuals. But at the same time, he also noticed, right, that there's a whole system of art, right? That you have curators, that you have art critics, that you have different kinds of committees which decide who is going to get how much money, and so on. And he said that, in fact, because of this system, he claimed that artist is a pseudo-subject. So that he is not a real subject of the art system, but that he is a pseudo-subject because everyone else profits from what this idea of artist and what the artist does. That everyone else profits from that except the artist. And so that's why he called him a pseudo-subject, and I talk more about it. The other important observation that he made was that, right, when we talk about work and creativity, he says creativity comes from creation, right? So who creates? And he says that the creation is the power of a deity, right, or a god. So we don't really create. He said we either work, or he even claimed that artists actually do research, right? So you always do something else. You don't really create because the creation is the domain of God, and your feelings about the religion and the possibility of creating rather than working, which is also very close to how Marx defines labor in general. He says that labor, not under capitalism, but in principle, is the way humans interact with nature and everything else. So a lot of things are in fact work in that sense. What this artist Goran Đorđević was noticing in Yugoslavia was that this idea of artists as these creative, exceptional beings was very, very present. And one of the reasons why this took place is because artists of these post-war generations, with very few exceptions, right, like Georgievich and another one, another collective that I discuss in the book, they also saw themselves as creators, not as workers, which made it easier then to divorce all these economic and labor rights from the merits of creativity. And this turned their labor into invisible labor and was then symptomatic for the undoing of artists as workers. So all of a sudden, once you become the creator and you don't work, it is very easy to take away the labor rights because you're no longer a worker, and the way you get remunerated, or the way based on what you get paid, is the quality of your creativity, which is extremely arbitrary. The book now then offers this the analysis also of these two cases, right? Because what also Goran Đorđević did was he called for an international strike of artists. That was in 1979. He wrote to a number of artists, not just from Yugoslavia, but from abroad. And he invited them, hey, would you be interested in an international strike of artists? And he got some responses, not too many. And out of those responses, not many were actually in favor of doing a strike, right? They were like, I mean, especially artists from the West, during the Cold War, were like, like we are already, like we are on the market, like how are we gonna strike, la la la, too much competition and so on and so forth, right? And so he kind of, after all that, he saw, okay, this is it's an illusion to be able to do a strike of artists because of all these issues, that even among artists who were very critical of the art market and of the commodification of art, there was still a reluctance in terms of, okay, can we withdraw the labor from all the institutions? Because imagine, like all the museums, they don't produce the art. The artists produce the art that goes into the museum. So, if everyone stops doing that or sending their work to the museums, then I don't know what these museums would do. What would they show, right? And it goes also for other institutions in the same similar way. That is one example that I think is really interesting in the Yugoslav case. The other one was a collective which was called Podrum, which means actually underground. And there was also a group of conceptual artists that were mostly based in Zagreb. And what they did, they had a more pragmatic approach to this whole problem of artists not being paid, right? And what they did was they suggested that artists should have a contract when they go to the institutions, right? So you are very familiar with this idea of outsourced labor, right? Because this is very present today. So, a lot of companies are outsourcing all sorts of services. And so this is what they also kind of claimed, is that artists are in fact outsourced labor. And so when they do provide content for museums, galleries, and other art institutions, they should have a contract. And then they really spelled out, everything that this contract was negotiating, the working conditions, who's paying for what, that they should be paid for the actual labor, for the design of the work, who puts up something, who's responsible for it. So it was a really interesting contract. But unfortunately, when I was talking with people who made it, who proposed this contract, it was not very often used. And I'll talk more about why that was the case tomorrow. Today I'll come back to back to what happened in Yugoslavia. So despite these important initiatives that were very critical of art, the problem of artistic labor and its exploitation was marginalized during the 1980s in Yugoslavia, and this was the final decade of Yugoslavia's existence. But what emerged was instead a very new agenda politically, and that was that politically they wanted to establish within Yugoslav socialism the so-called civil society. And this was promoted by the movements which were known as the 1980s alternative, and they were trying to create an alternative to self-managed socialism. But I joke in the book also that the key issue was alternative to what. So these movements mounted a critique of this very they called it oppressive ideology of socialist self-management. But what was very interesting was that they failed to realize that the problem was not too much self-management, but not enough of it. And so I discussed these dynamics from two viewpoints that both follow the process of transformation of art workers into these self-relying socialist entrepreneurs. One presents the undoing of labor-related cultural policy, which took place parallel to the critique of socialist ideology, and planted the seeds for neoliberal policies in the field of culture. And then the other one is that how these actors who were critical of socialist self-management forgot what were the mandates of the state. And then in the end, I also then reflect on this process, because what I call this process is a dispossession of artists' labor rights and the rise of inequality among art workers, especially after the destruction of Yugoslavia, because these processes, of course, continue in all the territory that used to be Yugoslavia. We have these similar issues going on. What I think is really important, and why I think what happened in Yugoslavia is important for us, is because it brings us back to our neoliberal moment, right? Neoliberal ideology actually divorces labor from art, but also labor from other forms of labor, I would say, because it uses this idea of creativity. You know, like there's a lot of things, do what you love what you do, right? I mean, there we have that, you know, we are at the heart of, you know, this kind of mentality and ideology. It's very close. And what is the problem here is precisely these ideas of creativity, right, which are in a way essentialized, and in this way, this idea of artist as a model worker, right, that's what neoliberal ideology actually takes from art and creativity, is that you are a creative individual, and you are very, you know, free, efficient, self-reliant, la 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 la. And so, in that sense, you know, Western ideas of creativity and autonomy are a very helpful assistance to neoliberal ideology. But what happens is that neoliberalism also attacks the state, right, or the state which provides certain welfare and social protections. And because of that, we have this double problem, right? On one hand, it elevates and uses the creativity to say, okay, you're all creative and self-reliant. At the same time, they attack all these welfare systems, and there we are, right? Creative entrepreneurs with no social, you know, social security, no labor standards, and so on. We do what we love, and the work doesn't love us back, really. Also, and that's why I argue that if we recognize art as a form of labor, it's not to say that this labor is not creative, that it is not important, or that it is not special. So I'm not trying to critique that, but what I'm trying to say is that the struggle for workers' rights needs to recognize this as a form of labor, because otherwise we are left to these very arbitrary forms of evaluating labor rather than securing certain standards, and then we can talk how exceptional we are, right? But let's first have some basic standards here. And so, but of course, the problem is that that what I mentioned at the beginning, right, that this idea that artist is someone who is very creative, that this is something really positive. In the cultural attitudes, art schools kind of nurture also this ideology, and that becomes a really, really serious issue, because when you try to organize art workers, this is very prevalent, not only in general cultural attitudes towards artwork, but then also among artists themselves. And so this is then the provocation of calling art as work, which I think it's useful to demystify this, but not in order to degrade it, but in fact to elevate it to some extent. And so that's why I like to say that with my book and with my work and my arguments, I'm trying to open an avenue to discuss art as labor, and not merely as creativity, because by divorcing art from the idea that it is also labor, we are not doing a favor to the future of art production, and also we neglect this class aspect of who can afford to be an artist, right? Because many times you would say, who can afford to be an artist? Who can afford to not be paid? And if we live in capitalism when everyone needs to work to live, and you know, if you are a worker, then you are also able to unionize, you're also able to fight for labor standards, so on and so forth. If you kind of throw that out, then you know, you are doing yourself a disservice. And I think that what I was trying to explain with really schematically describing what happened in socialist Yugoslavia is that this precise idea that artist work existed. But at one point, the ideas about autonomy and creativity took over. Of course, there was a whole geopolitical issue going on that I can't go into too much detail now, which also caused a huge crisis in the Yugoslav economy, which also contributed to the dismantling of the state. But at that precise point, the idea of artist work kind of went away, and these ideas of autonomy and creativity took over. And I think that if we continue to divorce these ideas, we are going to keep finding ourselves in the same problem. And that's where I think this history of Yugoslavia and what happened, and the way artists are actually living now in the post-Yugoslav era, is really important for us to understand that divorcing art from labor is really a misguided political strategy to come to better working conditions in the arts. So I'll leave it at that.